Let's get our RC car up and running in OpenRC Racer Part 2. Today we're going to be adding some gears and some electronics and hopefully taking our F1 car out for a test run. There is a bit of a twist to my build, however. Back in the early to mid 90s when I was younger, I was really into RC cars. I have a lot of that stuff left over from back in the day. I will be racing my F1 car up against Colin's F1 car, and he will be using a lot newer version of electronics. So I thought it would be an interesting comparison to compare an old school to what's available today and see what happens. Just to give you an idea of what we're dealing with, this is a 1400 milliamp 7.2 volt NiCad rechargeable battery 6 cell that I bought in 1995. This is a 2200 milliamp LiPo battery 11.1 volt that I bought last week. The old school battery weighs roughly 294 grams. The new battery weighs about 173 grams. The whole car with no electronics in it weighs 682 grams. That'll be an important number when we remeasure it later. So let's do it. Let's dust off the old RC gear and see if we can make this thing run. Here's the old school parts I'm dealing with. The 1400.72 volt NiCad battery, a 1997 Trinity Street Spec motor, a Futaba MC210CB speed controller from around 1995, a Futaba FP R112JE receiver terminal on an AM band, and my old school Futaba Magnum Sport 2-channel pistol grip controller. Note, it was made in October 1993. To give you another idea of the age of this controller, it takes 8 AA batteries. Yeah, I said 8. Really, the only new electronics that I'm using for this build is this HTX 900 servo. This is the steering servo for the car, and any of the old school stuff that I would have tried to use would have been way too big. So we had to go with this one. The only two printed parts you'll need for the electronics install is the front servo bracket and the pinion gear. I think I was calling the spur gear the pinion gear in the last video, but the small gear is the pinion gear. The larger gear is the spur gear. The only other hardware you should need is some sort of servo push rod for the front steering servo. I just bought longer ones and I cut mine down and bent it to look something like that. I'm using two M3 10mm screws to mount the motor with a couple of washers, and two M3 by 8mm screws to mount that front servo bracket. The only thing that's really changed from the first video is I changed out the M3 by 8mm screws that held the steering links in place. I went with some M3 by 10mm cap head screws and used a lock washer on the bottom. These should stay secure a lot better than just having a screw going through the top. First thing we'll do is we'll take the lid off. You have to remove these two turning vanes and the top lid should just pop off. Then we'll remove the body from the car. It's 6 M3 by 8mm screws. One here, two here, two here, and one back here in the center. Now that the body's off, we'll mount the front servo in these two holes here. The front servo bracket should line up just like that. We'll set the servo in the mount like this. Then we'll attach the servo from underneath with some M3 by 8mm screws. Now that the servo's in the car, we need to make a linkage from the servo saver over to the servo horn. I like to start by just putting it in the servo saver first. This will give you a rough idea of how long the linkage needs to be. Then I like to just temporarily put the servo horn on. This will give you an idea of how you need to bend the linkage to be able to make it into the servo horn. After a couple of test fits, I ended up with something that looks a lot like this. So we'll put the front in the servo saver, and we'll put the back in one of the holes in the servo horn. Then we should be able to steer our car. We might have to make some adjustments to this a little later, so for now I'm not going to put the screw in, but we'll put that in before we button it back up. Then we'll mount the motor back here using these two slots. I am going to be so bold to use the capacitors and the solder joints that I added when I was roughly 15 years old. We'll see how long they stand up. The motor mounts in here like this. I'm going to use two M3 by 10mm cap head screws with a couple of washers. I just put the motor in loose for now. The pinion gear does have a flat spot on it and the motor shaft is keyed, but it should just slide on. Then I just push the motor up enough to mate up with the spur gear. You don't want it too tight, but you want it pretty snug. Then you can tighten down those motor mount bolts. The spur gear does move side to side on the axle. I mounted the pinion gear so that it would at least mate up with some of the spur gear in any position. We might have to go back and investigate this later and come up with a different solution, but for now I think it's going to work. My speed control is already soldered to my motor, and there's a couple of capacitors on it. Now I'll hook up the front steering servo in the channel 1 position. My speed control is in the channel 2 position. On this receiver, channel 1 is the steering, and channel 2 is the trigger. Now I'm going to plug the battery in so that I can adjust the steering servo's horn. So I'm going to turn on the transmitter first, then I'll plug the battery in, and I'll turn the car on. The old school cars like to run away if you don't turn the transmitter on first. So I'm going to move the trim on the steering to somewhat in the middle. We'll put it right at 0. And then I'll remove the horn on the front servo. I'll adjust the steering to be somewhere in the center, and then put the horn back on. Let's prop the front of the car up and test out the steering. We'll adjust the trim a little to try to get it a little straighter. And that looks like a pretty good range of motion to me. Now we can turn the car back off and remove the battery. Now we'll install the servo horn screw and the servo mounting screws. Now we're done with the front servo. Now here's the tricky part. All the old school electronics are so large, they're going to have a hard time fitting in this body. The newer stuff, you can usually just toss it in here and it all fits just fine, and you can work on it via this lid. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put everything in here and then put the body back on after the fact and then try to rearrange it. Okay, I got most of the electronics in. That wasn't that easy. Now I'm going to put the body screws back on. So we'll put the 6 back in the bottom here. Okay, the body's back on, but fitting the battery in here is going to be a real trick. It just barely fit in there. Changing that battery out might be a real chore. So I was able to get it all in there, but there is no way I'm going to be able to fit this lid on with all that much stuff in there. So there's one drawback to the old school electronics right there. It's not going to look near as pretty. Also note what this car weighs now. 1,159 grams. But will it work? Does it still turn? Yes, it does. Well, it doesn't look the greatest, but it does work. Now it's time for a test run. Does it work? Yes. Are the electronics questionable? Probably. Am I going to have to use my dry cool wit and my amazing driving skills to even have a chance in winning this race? You bet. I hope you found this video helpful, or at least a little entertaining. If you did, please consider giving it a thumbs up or subscribing to my channel. If not, leave your thoughts in the comments below. And as always, thanks for watching, and we'll see you for part 3 on race day.